The sharp electric scent of ozone mixed with the damp rising from the cold concrete hit my nose as I rushed down the worn steps of the 7th Avenue subway station close to midnight. Behind me, footsteps pounded against the tiled walls, each heavy echo blending with the frantic beat of my heart until it felt as if it might burst. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly who was chasing me. I knew those furious blue eyes burning into my spine. I knew the hands that had left bruises on my arm just a few days ago. Kyle was not letting go. He had never let go of anything in his life. I tightened my grip on my bag, my foot slipping slightly on the damp tile as I reached the bottom of the stairs. The station was eerily empty, so different from the daytime rush when crowds surged like a flood. On the cold metal benches, only a homeless man slept curled beneath a thin blanket, and a young couple whispered arguments near the turnstiles. Everything else was still, a silence so deep I could hear every ragged breath scraping out of me. My hands shook so badly that my Metro card fell to the ground twice before I managed to swipe it. The beep of the reader, sharp and metallic, echoed through the station like a gunshot. I shoved through the turnstile and sprinted toward the platform just as Kyle roared from the stairwell, his voice rolling through the tunnel like the snarl of some hunting animal. "Emily, you can't run from me." He used that familiar tone, half anger, half sugary false affection, the same tone that once convinced me every problem between us was somehow my fault. I had never been as terrified of him as I was tonight. The platform floor was slick beneath my shoes, the air tinged with the metallic tang of iron and electricity. The digital board flickered its message. The next train arriving in 2 minutes. 2 minutes suddenly stretched out like an entire lifetime. I backed toward the far end of the platform, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the moment Kyle would appear. I just needed to get on that train, to leave the man who had turned my life into an invisible cage. I had once been a nurse at a district hospital, someone who believed she understood strength, someone who believed she knew how to walk away from things that hurt. I had walked away from Kyle. I had escaped him and moved twice. I thought that meant freedom. But freedom lasted barely a few weeks, until tonight. When I stepped out of my late shift in the emergency room and saw him standing there by the back exit, holding a bouquet of red roses the color of a warning sign. "Emily, don't be dramatic," he had said, as if stalking me for weeks was a harmless misunderstanding. When Kyle stepped onto the platform, I froze. His footsteps struck the tile like a hammer against my ribs. "Emily, I just want to talk. Why do you have to make everything so difficult?" I backed up until my heel touched the edge of the yellow warning strip. Behind me stretched the dark mouth of the tunnel, cold and gaping like some waiting beast. I shouted, "Kyle, stop! You're not allowed near me. The restraining order is still in effect." "You can't come near me." Kyle laughed, a short, sharp, contemptuous sound. "You think a piece of paper can stop a Valenti? My father owns the precinct, Emily. The police work for us, not you." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "No one can protect you from me. I'm trying to save us." I didn't even have time to brace before he lunged, his fingers clamped around my arm, right over the bruises that hadn't yet faded. I fought back, but he was stronger. "Let me go," I screamed, but my voice dissolved into the empty air. No one turned. No one spoke. Kyle jerked me closer, his breath hot and furious against my ear. "You can't survive without me. You're weak. You need someone to control you." I swung my bag hard against his chest. He stumbled back a step. I twisted free, but the wet tile betrayed me. My foot slipped. Kyle lunged again, wild and furious. Ungrateful. His shove hit my shoulder hard. The platform vanished beneath me. I plunged into nothingness before the scream even left my throat. My body hit the railbed with a bone-shaking shock, pain flaring through my knees and shoulder. I looked up just in time to see Kyle standing on the platform edge, his face drained, his hands trembling. But he didn't jump down. He didn't call for help. He stared down the tunnel instead. That was when I saw it. The train's headlights, two white orbs cutting through the darkness, the screech of metal echoing like a scream. Kyle looked at me, eyes wide with terror. And then he turned. He ran. He left me on the tracks. Alone. With a train hurtling toward me. Only a few seconds left. The ground trembled harder, the blaring horn slicing through the air as the blinding beam locked onto me. I thought I was about to die. But at that exact moment, from the platform above, a figure leapt down like a bolt of lightning. A strong arm closed around me, and the world abruptly changed. If you've listened this far and something in this story has stirred a feeling inside you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every single day. And if you don't mind, would you tell me where you're watching from? Leave a comment below and let us know which corner of the world this story has reached. We treasure every word you share with us. That arm pulled me up in one decisive motion, so fast my mind couldn't keep up until my face was pressed against a man's chest, his breath sharp and steady, the faint scent of warm wood drifting from his cologne. We tumbled together onto the edge of the platform just as the train roared past behind us, a violent rush of air sweeping over everything as if determined to swallow the world whole. The shriek of metal grinding against the tracks sliced through the station, rattling through every trembling muscle in my body still locked in shock and terror. I felt the man's hand resting firmly on my shoulder, holding tight as though making sure I was still here, still alive. It took several seconds before I dared open my eyes. He was lying on his side, his face so close I could see the strands of sweat-damp hair clinging to his forehead, and the cold gray of his eyes fixed on me without blinking. It wasn't panic. It wasn't the curious or pitying stare passers-by often give someone who's just barely escaped death. It was sharp, controlled, eerily steady, as if pulling a stranger off the tracks mere seconds before impact had barely stirred him. But what rooted me in place was the unmistakable sense of safety radiating from him, a certainty I couldn't explain. I didn't know his name, didn't know why he was there at that exact moment, and I certainly couldn't understand why, in all that chaos, looking into his eyes calmed me more than anything had in months. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and firm. I nodded, my throat dry, my voice trapped somewhere behind fear and adrenaline. I think I'm still alive." A faint hint of a smile tugged at his mouth, as if the act itself was something unfamiliar to him. "Being alive is good," he replied as he stood and extended a hand to pull me up from the cold tiles. Once I was on my feet, my legs still unsteady, I finally noticed the way he was dressed. A white dress shirt wrinkled from the fall, a dark gray vest, tailored slacks, polished leather shoes. He looked like someone who just walked away from a private dinner, not from the belly of a subway track. I wanted to thank him, but my throat tightened. Too many emotions crashed over me at once: fear, confusion, gratitude, and something else. Something deeper that I couldn't name. I stammered, How did you know I was down there?" He didn't answer immediately. He glanced toward the far end of the platform where Kyle had disappeared. His eyes narrowed, his lips tightening into an expression colder than any I had ever seen. "I was there at the right time," he said simply. "Did you see that man?" He pushed me. I heard exactly what happened, Emily. His answer stunned me. I didn't remember telling him my name. How did he know it? He looked at me, unwavering, unflinching. "There are questions you shouldn't ask yet. he said quietly. I fell silent. Part of me wanted to run, to call the police, to scream at the realization that this man might know more than he pretended to. But another part, the part he had pulled from the jaws of death, wanted only to stand here, within the one pocket of safety I had felt in months. I opened my mouth to ask his name, but the announcement overhead echoed through the station. The next train will arrive in 7 minutes. A group of passengers descended the stairs, and the lights at the platform brightened slightly. He stepped back, his eyes no longer as fierce, but still sharp enough to cut. I need to leave. Would you like to come with me? I didn't know if I should trust him, but I knew staying meant giving Kyle the chance to return. I nodded. He tilted his head, signaling for me to walk ahead, and as we left the platform, I still didn't know his name, didn't know why he knew mine, but I knew this. The look in his eyes would stay with me for a long time, like the hand that had pulled me from death and fear. I woke up in an unfamiliar room, its high ceiling lined with ornate molding, soft light filtering through sheer gray curtains. The scent of mint and faint leather floated in the air. The sheets beneath me were clean and soft, but the first thing I felt was the pounding of my heart, as if my body was still trapped inside the terror of last night. I sat up quickly, scanning the room. Everything was immaculate in a way that felt almost unsettling. Polished wooden floors, a black and white photograph of 1940s New York on the wall, a solid oak table holding a tea set, a gray velvet armchair positioned neatly in the corner. This room didn't belong to any hospital I had ever worked in, and it certainly wasn't my temporary rented apartment. The door opened just as I stepped off the bed. The man who had saved me walked in carrying a tray of tea. He was wearing the same white shirt, this time neatly buttoned, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He didn't look like someone who'd hurled himself onto subway tracks the night before. He set the tray down and looked at me. "You're awake. Thank God." His voice was low, gentle, not commanding or controlling, yet strong enough to make me pause, as if he were saying something that mattered. Where am I?" I asked, trying to steady my breathing. "My private apartment, in Brooklyn Heights. You passed out when I got you out of the station. Joseph, my head of security, helped me bring you here. I couldn't take you to the hospital then. You needed rest, and you needed to be safe. Joseph is guarding the door now so no one can get in." I wasn't sure what to believe first, his story or the instinct whispering that a man like him does not appear in someone's life without reason. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers twisting together. "I'm not injured, right? Nothing serious?" "Nothing serious, just a few scrapes on your shoulder and knees." I checked. "You need water, breakfast, and then we can talk." I lifted my gaze to his, and only then did I notice the strange depth in his gray eyes, as if beneath his calm surface there was a silent sea, churning. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his hands resting on his knees, not trying to come closer. He was keeping a respectful distance, as if he knew exactly how frayed my nerves were. "My name is Daniel Moretti. You asked, but you didn't give me the chance to answer." "Emily," I said quietly, though I knew he already knew. "I still don't understand why you were at the station last night. It wasn't a place I should have been, but I was. For work. And because I happened to see you." I frowned. What kind of work takes someone to a subway platform close to midnight? He studied me for a moment, then spoke in a voice that was almost too calm. "I work in logistics. Shipping. Sometimes there are important shipments I need to check in person." A part of me didn't believe him. The way he moved, the way he observed everything, the way he controlled the space around him, none of it matched any logistics businessman I'd ever met. But I didn't push. Not now. "I just want to know, is Kyle still out there?" Did anyone find him? I had the area checked. He left the station before the police arrived. Have you called them? I shook my head, my eyes burning. I've called them before. I have a restraining order, but it never works. He always finds me. Daniel nodded slowly, his voice dropping. I understand. Some men don't stop until someone makes them stop. He poured tea into 2 porcelain cups, sliding one toward me. You don't have to trust me right now, but if you allow it, I can keep you safe, at least until you decide what to do next. I looked at him for a long time. Every instinct in me was still alert, still trembling with everything I had survived. But somehow, in the wreckage of the night before, I found myself here rescued, given a choice, and looking into the eyes of a man I didn't understand, but who seemed to understand me more than anyone ever had. I sat quietly for a long moment, my fingers laced together, my eyes fixed on the steaming cup of tea. Daniel didn't rush me, didn't press for answers, simply waited, as if he understood that what I needed most right now was a space wide enough and safe enough to open the door I had kept locked for so long. I drew in a deep breath. Sometimes people avoid telling their stories because they fear they'll collapse halfway through, but silence makes everything heavier. I began with the simplest truth. Kyle wasn't always like that. Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression free of judgment, listening in a stillness that felt almost protective. I met him at the hospital during a night shift. He brought his mother in because she was having trouble breathing. Kyle was polite then, gracious, thanking me over and over. He asked for my number when she was discharged, and I gave it. I felt foolish admitting that, but it was the truth. In the beginning, Kyle was gentle. He took me out to dinner, asked about my favorite things, praised my hard work, told me I was thoughtful and kind. He made me feel as if I had finally met a good man. I laughed more, walked into work with a lighter heart, even imagined a steady future for myself. Everything changed so slowly I didn't notice when it went off course. It began with questions framed as concern. Are you home yet? Why are you working so late? Who are you with? Then came the mild suggestions that felt like a breeze passing by. Maybe don't go out with those friends anymore. They're not good for you. You meet a lot of men as a nurse. I just want to make sure you're safe. But the suggestions grew into demands. You can't wear a skirt that short. You don't need to visit your mother that often. She just stresses you out. And by the time I realized it, I had drifted away from my friends, rarely called my family, and found myself apologizing for things I hadn't even done wrong. When I was tired, he said I was weak. When I was sad, he said I was too sensitive. When I pushed back, he said I was making a big deal out of nothing. I started doubting myself. I thought maybe I really was too fragile, too demanding, too unreasonable. But then one evening, after a long shift, Kyle exploded just because I hadn't texted him beforehand. He grabbed my arm, squeezing so hard I cried out. I remember his eyes that night still blue, but stripped of every bit of warmth. They looked like someone trying desperately to hold down a creature refusing to stay still. The next day, he apologized. Kyle's apologies were as perfect as his displays of affection. He brought flowers, cooked dinner, held me for a long time. You know I love you, he said. I'm just afraid of losing you. I once believed that was what love looked like, that someone worrying so much they needed to control everything meant they cared, that I had to change so he could feel secure. And so I let that control grow, like a shadow swallowing who I really was. The breaking point came the day he showed up at the hospital and caused a scene in the lobby because I didn't answer my phone during work hours. I was so humiliated I wanted to disappear. That day, I decided to leave. I packed my things, moved to another neighborhood, blocked his number, rearranged my shifts, Told my manager I requested a restraining order. I did everything everyone tells you to do, but I didn't know who his family really was back then. Kyle isn't just a nurse, Daniel. He's the youngest son of the Valenti crime family. He only took the hospital job to look normal, to rebel against his father. But the moment I tried to leave, the mask fell off. His family's lawyers crushed my complaints. The police reports vanished. Every time he broke the law, his father's money made it disappear. He found where I lived within a few weeks. At first, it was flowers left at my door. Then notes. Then he appeared during my night shifts, pretending it was coincidence. Every time I saw him, the feeling inside me wasn't sadness or anger anymore. It was fear, deep and marrow deep. I lifted the teacup, my hands still trembling. Daniel remained silent, though the darkness in his eyes deepened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty advice, didn't tell me to be strong. He simply listened, and in that quiet, I felt believed for the first time. After a long while, Daniel spoke softly. Emily, what happened to you isn't your fault. Men like Kyle use fear to take over someone's life, and he won't stop unless someone forces him to. I clutched the edge of the blanket, closing my eyes for a few seconds to breathe. I know. Last night I saw that more clearly than ever, when he watched me fall onto the tracks. I opened my eyes, meeting Daniel's gaze. He didn't save me. He ran. Daniel nodded slowly, his voice steady as steel. And that is exactly why, Emily, you don't have to face this alone anymore. I didn't know whether he meant it as a promise or a statement of fact. But for the first time in many months, the fear in my chest no longer crowded out every breath I tried to take. I was still trembling, but I was no longer trembling alone. The next morning, Emily washed her face in the kitchen of the safe apartment, the cold water hitting her skin as if trying to rinse away the fears of the night before, but the unease clung to her like a shirt too tight to peel off. She reminded herself that yesterday had passed, that Kyle was no longer near her, and that Daniel was watching, protecting her. Returning to the hospital, her steps along the familiar corridor felt strangely fragile. Every sound struck her nerves: rolling carts, call lights, footsteps from colleagues, each one tightening something inside her chest. She slipped behind the nurse's station, trying to focus on work, checking charts, sorting medication. Yet her mind wandered back to Kyle's icy blue eyes, to the way his hand had felt when he shoved her on the tracks. Coworkers greeted her with polite smiles, their words brushing against her like soft touches on a bruise, reminding her that normal life was waiting for her, though getting back to it would not be simple. She stepped into the break room, sat down, closed her eyes for a moment, trying to imagine herself at home somewhere far from Kyle, far from fear, but the comfort flickered and vanished almost instantly. Her phone buzzed Daniel's message. Don't worry, I'm watching everything. Just that. No pressure, no demands, just a reminder that she was not alone. Emily sent back a brief reply before forcing herself to focus on the next shift. Patients flowed in, emergencies rose and fell, her hands busy with needles and IV lines, but her heart still hovered somewhere between last night's terror and the fragile safety she was grasping now. A few times she glanced toward the windows, imagining Kyle standing there, waiting for one careless moment. The thought forced her to take a deep breath and remind herself she still had choices. At lunch, she ate a small salad in the break room, her eyes glued to her phone, scrolling through unread messages from family and friends she had avoided. Emily realized she hadn't shut them out because she didn't care, but because she feared they wouldn't understand. Feared their questions would drag her back into a story she wasn't ready to tell again. She missed her mother, missed the comfort of her voice, but also remembered how alone she had felt when she needed someone most. A sharp ache rose inside her, but so did a quiet determination. She had to live, not just survive. Returning to patient rooms after lunch, Emily saw the frightened faces, the shaking hands, and recognized that her work now was not only about saving others, it was also about saving herself. She spoke with colleagues, answered patient questions, guided interns through their tasks, trying to make every motion look normal. But even when she smiled, her eyes held a watchfulness she couldn't hide. When her shift finally ended, Emily stepped out of the hospital and onto the crowded New York sidewalk, the city alive with traffic, people, and the bright lights spilling from Times Square. She inhaled deeply, the wind hitting her face, the smell of fuel, humid air, and street food filling her lungs, reminding her she was still here. But in the back of her mind, Kyle's shadow still flickered, a warning that danger could step out of the dark at any moment. She took out her phone and messaged Daniel. "I'm home. Everything's fine." Only a few words, but enough to say she was still standing. When the door to the safe apartment closed behind her, Emily exhaled, sinking onto the sofa, her hand gripping the blanket as her thoughts tangled. She tried to organize her mind, rebuild routines, commit to normalcy, but she knew this return wasn't complete. She still had to stay alert, still had to watch, still had to keep distance from the past. But this time, she had Daniel. She had a safe place. And most importantly, she had her own will. She told herself she would not let Kyle or anyone control her life again. Each day, though filled with exhaustion and fear, was one small step toward finding herself again, reclaiming her breath, and believing that someday she would truly return to the life she chose, free and safe. The next morning, as Emily stepped out onto the balcony of the safe apartment and breathed in the sharp, cold air of the city, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar notification, an unnamed message that read, "I know where you are." A wave of dread rose instantly inside her, her heartbeat pounding, her breath catching. She looked around. The apartment was still quiet, untouched, no sign of intrusion. Yet the single line on her screen was enough to tighten every nerve in her body like a drawn string. Immediately, memories surged back the grip of Kyle's hand, the hatred burning in his eyes, the chilling weight of his control, and the fear she thought she had buried sprang back to life. Emily forced herself to breathe, typed a short reply. "I'm fine. Don't bother me." No response, only silence, cold and deliberate. She knew Kyle was watching, testing boundaries, reminding her through carefully crafted messages that he could reach her whenever he wanted. Her chest tightened at the memory of the times he'd left signs, notes, flowers, each one a quiet promise that he was always one step away. Emily didn't call Daniel right away. She knew he would react, and part of her needed some small sense of control over her fear, even if it was only for a moment. She walked through the apartment, checking windows, scanning exits, glancing at her phone again and again, sending another message, and still receiving nothing in return. Inside, tension coiled tighter with every breath. A few hours later, she heard footsteps and Joseph opened the door, his eyes reading the strain on her face before he asked softly, "Everything all right?" Emily nodded, her voice rough. "Just an old message." Joseph didn't push, simply moved to the kitchen to make coffee, but the fear inside her didn't fade. It sank deeper when she checked her phone again and saw the second message, a photo taken from a distance of the safe apartment itself, morning light filtering through the curtains, enough for her to realize that Kyle had found her refuge. She stood frozen, her heart gripping painfully, her entire body trembling in a mix of rage and terror. Everything she had worked so hard to rebuild, the fragile sense of normalcy she was beginning to reclaim, suddenly felt overturned in seconds. She inhaled deeply, telling herself she had to call Daniel, but she stopped. Realizing he always appeared at exactly the right moment, always seemed one step ahead, and perhaps he already knew. Emily sank onto the sofa, her hands trembling as she held the phone, her eyes fixed on the screen as she remembered Daniel's warnings: never go anywhere alone, never step outside without protection, never underestimate Kyle. She realized then that returning to normal life was still far away, that the fear she thought she had buried lived not just in memory but in the present, through the evidence Kyle left behind. Images of the train, the tracks, Daniel's eyes as he pulled her back from death flashed through her mind, creating a swirling mix of safety and danger, life and death standing side by side. She listened closely. Every sound in the apartment sharpened the wind outside, the hum of traffic, Joseph's footsteps, all of it tightening her vigilance. Emily typed a short message to Daniel. "You should see this." The phone remained silent for several minutes. Her heart continued to race, but now it was the strain of waiting. The fragile trust that Daniel would appear, would protect her as he had before. Even as she faced Kyle's message alone, trapped between fear and the shrinking sense of control inside herself. Each passing minute made it clearer that her world had changed forever, that the peace she was trying to build was temporary, easily torn apart by Kyle's shadow, and she understood that normal life was only an illusion, something she would have to fight for, piece by piece. She lowered her head, her eyes burning, but inside her chest a hard resolve formed. She would not let Kyle dictate her life anymore, would not run again, would find a way to live, not just survive, even if every step she took came with a shadow following close behind. And when Daniel arrived, she knew she wouldn't be alone. The afternoon at the hospital dragged slowly, and Emily tried to focus on her work, but every ringing phone, every unfamiliar message made her flinch. She had just wheeled a patient out of the emergency room, her hand still pressed to a blood pressure cuff, when she saw Daniel standing at the end of the hallway, motionless, his long coat draped over his shoulders, his deep brown eyes locked on her with a calm intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. Without saying a word, he moved toward her, each step strong yet controlled, drawing no attention from the staff or patients around them. Emily barely had time to react before he was beside her, leaning in just enough for his voice low and steady to reach her. "Emily." Outside. She nodded, a wash of relief and tension rising together. Joseph appeared moments later, his gaze sweeping the hallway, assessing exits, corners, shadows, every potential threat. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle, not gripping, but firm enough to guide her, to reassure her she was shielded. They moved out of the patient area, Daniel leading her through a side corridor, avoiding cameras and curious eyes, each step chosen with intention. Emily kept her head down, her heart slamming against her ribs, caught between fear and the strange safety he provided. Joseph followed behind, vigilant, his hand near his coat pocket where his protective tools were kept. When they reached the back parking lot, Daniel stopped, his voice quiet but absolute. "Get in the car." No hesitation. Emily climbed into the black SUV, her body still buzzing with cold sweat, her eyes drifting back toward the hospital building where her fear had surfaced yet again, now looking small, distant. Daniel slid in beside her, extending his hand, his gaze meeting hers with a silent promise that she wouldn't face this war alone. Joseph pulled out, movements quick but measured, his eyes constantly flicking to the mirrors, watching for threats. Emily felt the tension in the car, but underneath it, a deep sense of safety, the presence of Daniel steadying her even as her nerves trembled. After several minutes, he spoke softly. "No one knows we're here." She nodded, trying to steady her voice though her heart still raced. Outside, the city blurred past streetlights, signs, crowds appearing like a thin veil hiding the danger that Kyle still represented. Daniel kept her hand in his, light but certain, and the touch grounded her, anchoring her between fear and trust. She listened to the hum of the engine, the horns in the distance, each sound triggering a reflex of tension through her body. When they stopped in front of a small building with shuttered windows and heavy security, Daniel looked directly into her eyes. "This will be temporary. You'll be safe." Emily swallowed hard, a strange blend of fear and comfort filling her chest, knowing that from this moment forward, every step she took would be guarded, every breath protected, even as Kyle's presence lingered like a dark echo. Joseph stepped out first, scanning the surroundings before signaling them to follow. Daniel helped Emily out, guiding her through the dim corridor toward the elevator, his eyes scanning each corner, every detail, every possible sign of danger. Emily felt his hand resting lightly on her back, steady and cautious, a mixture of protection and unspoken reassurance. The elevator doors opened and they stepped inside. Daniel pressed the button for the top floor, his gaze never leaving her, as if sending a message without words that she would not have to walk through this alone. When the doors opened, soft light spilled into a long hallway, and Daniel led her forward, step by deliberate step, Joseph close behind, the silence thick with alertness and authority. Emily looked around. The temporary apartment wasn't hers, but everything had been prepared with meticulous care, from reinforced locks to the quiet placement of small cameras, all under Daniel's precise control. She stood there for a moment, caught between fear and the first hint of relief. Daniel watched her, his eyes deep and steady, and asked quietly, "Are you all right?" She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm all right." He gave a small nod, said nothing more, and led her into the main room where everything was ready: clothes, food, medicine. Emily sank onto the sofa, her hands still trembling, but for the first time since morning, she felt a sliver of peace, knowing she had slipped out of immediate danger, sheltered by Daniel's presence. Emily curled into the wide sofa of the safe apartment, still clutching her handbag, her eyes drifting to the window where the city lights shimmered like distant stars, comforting, yet impossibly far away. Daniel stood silently near the kitchen, his tall frame like a protective wall between her and whatever threat lingered beyond the glass. His gaze flicked toward her now and then, saying nothing, only watching, and she felt the weight of his presence steadying, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. The noise of the street had faded into a soft blur, the horns and footsteps melting into the fragile quiet of the room, yet inside her, a nameless fear stretched awake, a trembling awareness that she had been saved from death, but not yet freed from Kyle's shadow. Emily pressed her palms to her knees, forcing a slow breath, reaching for the tiny thread of peace within her, but every pulse in her veins dragged her back to the memory of Daniel's grip, his powerful hands pulling her out of the tracks at the last second, the moment she thought her life had ended. The apartment was meticulously arranged: soft lights, neutral colors, cameras placed with discreet precision, yet Emily felt suspended between two worlds. One safe but unfamiliar, sheltered yet held, a place she belonged to only because danger had forced her into it. Daniel eventually moved closer, placing a glass of water on the coffee table before her, his voice low and quiet. "Do you want something to eat?" Emily shook her head, her lips trembling, caught between gratitude and the discomfort of being protected so completely. She looked into his eyes, deep and cool like polished steel, yet holding a faint warmth she couldn't grasp, a warmth that made her both trust and fear him. The silence thickened around them, broken only by their breathing and the soft ticking of a clock, and Emily felt her emotions crowding together: fear, relief, curiosity about the man in front of her, and uncertainty about the world she had suddenly stepped into. Daniel sat in the armchair opposite her, exhaling quietly, not looking directly at her, but his presence still filled the room. She felt every shift of his posture, every breath he took, a strange mix of safety and pressure wrapping around her. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to push away the painful memories Kyle's control, his threats, his words that sliced into her sense of self. But the harder she tried to forget, the clearer she felt the difference between being threatened and being protected, between the terror she had endured and the strange salvation of being pulled back to life by a stranger. When Emily opened her eyes, the room was still and orderly, no immediate danger in sight. But worry still pulsed beneath her ribs, mingling with a strange closeness she had never felt before, a closeness that soothed and unsettled her in equal measure. She didn't know whether to trust fully or hold herself back, whether the man watching over her did so for good reasons, or for reasons she couldn't yet see. But she knew one truth. He was the only barrier between her and death, between her and the danger stalking her from outside. Emily rose quietly, walking around the apartment, each step feeling like both freedom and confinement, her gaze drifting to Daniel's every movement, studying him, trying to understand him, trying to grasp even a sliver of calm in the chaos. Daniel finally looked up at her, his voice low and deliberate. "You should sleep. You need rest." Emily nodded, her heart beating fast, comfort and unease woven tightly together. She knew the night would be long, but it would be the first night she did not face the darkness alone, and in that moment, the fragile balance of fear and peace, trust and caution, filled her mind as she realized everything from here on would change. The next morning, Emily woke with exhaustion still clinging to her, but a faint relief stirred when she looked around the quiet apartment. Nothing had changed, everything was still in place, still safe. But she knew this peace was temporary, that beyond these walls Kyle was still moving, still hiding, still hunting, and Daniel would not let her face him alone. He appeared as she was making coffee, tall and commanding, his sharp eyes carrying both cold calculation and a flicker of care. He handed her a phone and said quietly, "I need you to sit here. Don't move until I tell you." Then he walked out of the room, leaving Emily with her racing heart and her mind spinning with dangerous possibilities. She watched as Daniel moved through the hallways, each step precise and deliberate, as if every motion was predetermined. He stopped at the door of a hidden room, opened his laptop, and began working with swift, controlled movements. The tapping of keys and the glow of the screen cast a cold rhythm across his face, revealing not just a protector, but someone who operated in a world she had never imagined. Emily saw the data sheets, location maps, security camera feeds, the logs of messages and digital trails, all of it monitored and analyzed as Daniel tracked Kyle's movements, identified threats, and calculated every possibility. She felt a ripple of awe and fear at the breadth of control Daniel held, at the shadows he operated within, shadows that protected her, but also hinted at a power far beyond anything she knew. Emily sat quietly on the sofa, her heart beating with a mix of tension and fascination. She understood then that Daniel had not only saved her from the tracks, he was building a network around her, tracing Kyle's connections, searching for weaknesses, ensuring that no one would ever reach her without going through him. And that realization made her feel completely protected and a little trapped. When Daniel returned, his gaze slid over her, steady and reassuring. "I know you're worried, but you need to trust me not because I'm better, but because I won't let anything happen to you." Emily nodded, her lips trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the combination of safety and uncertainty he carried. She had never met anyone whose strength and authority came paired with such deliberate, quiet protection. Daniel could bend entire parts of the city to his will if he wanted, and he was choosing to use that power to keep her alive. In the hours that followed, Emily watched him make calls, send encrypted messages, coordinate with operatives, track Kyle's movements with an efficiency that made her realize she was now part of a world ruled by strategy, shadows, and unwavering control. Daniel moved in the center of it all, not just a guardian, but the orchestrator of every variable that determined her survival. Emily couldn't look away from him. She was drawn in and overwhelmed at the same time, recognizing that any illusion she'd had about safety was now tied unmistakably to him. As night fell, she stood by the window, watching the city lights shimmer against the glass, feeling both a soft relief and a lingering tension. Daniel had done everything to keep her safe, but the truth that she now lived inside the sphere of his power left her grateful and uneasy all at once. She understood then that her life would never return to the quiet it once had. She had stepped into a world where power, danger, and survival were woven together, and Daniel stood at the center of it, holding back the darkness for her. Emily couldn't sleep, the city lights filtering through the thin curtains and casting pale reflections across the quiet room thick with tension, and she found herself wondering about Daniel, the man who had pulled her back from the edge of near-certain death on the tracks, yet also the man she realized she barely understood. A man whose actions and decisions made her trust him and question him in the same breath. She began noticing the small details she had overlooked before: how he moved, how he scanned every corner of a room, how he spoke to Joseph or his associates over the phone with a tone that was both sharp and controlled, yet threaded with moments of softness so fleeting they could only be seen by someone who was truly watching. Emily found herself wondering who he really was, whether Daniel was simply a powerful, wealthy man with an extraordinary sense of responsibility, or someone standing at the helm of a hidden world, someone capable of orchestrating and manipulating situations with precision to keep her safe. The question dug deeper into her mind, stirring fear and curiosity at the same time. She remembered his eyes on the tracks, that cold determination mixed with something fiercely protective, the combination that had made her trust him without hesitation in that split second. But now, inside the safe apartment, watching him process information and connect clues with a clarity far beyond ordinary intuition, Emily felt something that stretched past the boundaries of normal understanding. She began to realize that Daniel's involvement in her life wasn't simply coincidence or heroism. He had been watching, observing her in every reaction, every word, every fear. And while she felt grateful, she also felt the weight of being under someone else's quiet control. She wondered about the source of his power, the authority he carried like a second skin, the way Joseph followed his commands without question, how he coordinated every possibility to ensure she remained untouched. Everything was too perfect, too seamless, and Emily couldn't help wondering if she had stepped out of one web of control only to enter another, even if this one was wrapped in protection rather than threat. She remembered the earlier conversations, the way Daniel spoke about his operatives, about tracking Kyle, analyzing every clue with unwavering focus. His eyes had been sharp, his voice steady, and Emily had felt the unmistakable presence of a man accustomed to moving in the shadows, using power not for cruelty, but for preservation. Still, she felt both safe and unsettled, unsure if she truly understood the man standing beside her or the world he lived in, unsure if he appeared in her life as a miracle or as a piece of a puzzle she didn't yet see. She recalled the seemingly harmless things he had done: the way he checked her phone, the way he secured every window and door, the way he appeared exactly when she needed him. Every detail made her think there was far more he kept hidden. Was Daniel simply her rescuer, or was he a man standing on the edge of what was lawful and unlawful, wielding a power far beyond what she had known? Emily felt her heart tugged between fear and fascination. She realized survival wasn't just physical anymore. It was about discerning who Daniel truly was, whether he would reveal himself fully or keep her in the dark, whether she lived under absolute protection or inside a carefully designed net of strategy and vigilance. She couldn't ignore her doubts, but she also couldn't deny the safety he brought into her life. Her heartbeat quickened at the thought of facing the truth about him, sensing both strength and danger in every look, every gesture. She began to see Daniel differently, not only as the man who saved her, but as a mystery she needed to understand. The blend of suspicion and curiosity making her aware that from now on, survival depended not only on escaping Kyle, but on comprehending Daniel, his power, his protection, and the shadows that followed him. Emily knew a part of her life was now bound to this man, and to survive, she had to uncover the person behind those cool eyes and that quiet, controlled strength. Night settled over the safe apartment, the faint glow of streetlights washing across the walls, and Emily sat curled on the sofa with her arms wrapped around her knees, watching Daniel as he stood near the window, looking out at the city as though he belonged to it and yet hovered outside its reach. The silence stretched so long it felt fragile, but Emily sensed an invitation in it, a space where the truth could be spoken, and she chose to open her heart, gently asking about his childhood, about who he had been before power and shadows became part of his life. Daniel turned back to her, his eyes deep, holding a mixture of memory and caution. Then he sat down beside her, his broad shoulders forming a quiet shelter. He began talking about his childhood in the outskirts of New Jersey, about the old house with an overgrown backyard where he learned to observe and fend for himself, because his parents were always consumed by work. He spoke of his older brother, the one he lost when he was 12, a grief that reshaped him into someone disciplined, guarded, and often distant. Emily listened, feeling both close to him and strangely far, realizing this man had endured far more than he ever allowed others to see. Daniel continued with stories of his early days in the world she couldn't yet imagine, of betrayals and broken alliances, of decisions that left scars even when they had been made for the right reasons. He didn't avoid the pain or the truth. He spoke of loneliness and the weight of protecting others at any cost, and Emily felt her chest tighten when he admitted that fear was not absent from his life, only concealed beneath a hardened exterior. She saw then that Daniel was not just powerful. He was human, shaped by loss and battle, carrying wounds that ran just as deep as hers. Emily found herself sharing her own years of pain, the way Kyle had manipulated her, made her doubt herself, controlled her every movement and decision. She spoke of the loneliness, of crying in her empty apartment after pretending everything was fine, and Daniel listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on her, his hand occasionally resting gently on her shoulder. Not to influence her, but simply to let her know she was not alone. Emily realized this was the first time she had spoken everything aloud, the first time she didn't have to hide or reassure anyone, including herself. Daniel then shared other memories about a girlfriend he had lost, about relationships that had crumbled, about the sting of betrayal that he carried quietly. Emily felt her heartbeat shift into rhythm with his, a sense of connection rising between them, built not on fear or protection, but on understanding. She realized that both of them were survivors, each fighting their way through pain, each choosing to protect others in the only ways they knew how. Daniel fell silent for a moment, then looked at her with eyes warm and tired, telling her that sharing didn't make him weaker, if anything. It made him remember that he was still human. Emily nodded softly, the turmoil inside her beginning to ease, realizing that sharing childhood wounds, losses, and hidden fractures was their way of finding each other in the dangerous world they now walked. They sat together, saying nothing more, only sharing the quiet, sharing presence, And in that moment, Emily felt a rare peace drift into her heart, a sense of trust she had not felt in years. She knew then that Daniel was not just the man who had saved her on the tracks, but someone who understood her, someone who felt her fears and her strength, someone who could walk with her through the shadows of her past. She let her eyes fall closed for a moment, letting their shared pain settle, letting the warmth and safety of his presence seep into her bones. That night was not just a moment of confession, it was a connection. A deep, quiet recognition of two wounded people finding each other, and Emily understood that from this moment on, neither of them would face the darkness alone. Emily sat beside Daniel on the wide sofa, the soft glow from the table lamp casting a faint light across her face, illuminating the remnants of tension still clinging to her expression, her heart pounding wildly as she realized the space between them was slowly closing, a nearness that made her feel both breathless and afraid. Afraid that any movement might shatter the fragile sense of safety she had only just begun to recover. Daniel leaned toward her, his dark eyes deep and steady, filled with a tenderness that held its own quiet gravity, and he lifted a hand to her face, his fingertips brushing her cheek with a gentleness that carried an unspoken message, a promise wrapped in silence. Emily exhaled softly, caught between the instinct to retreat and the desire to lean in, fear and longing colliding in her chest, while Daniel moved closer, the faint scent of cedarwood and warm soap surrounding him and reaching her like a memory she didn't know she needed. She felt her heart beat faster than it had the night he pulled her from the tracks, and he gently tilted her chin upward with a touch that was both deliberate and careful. His lips meeting hers in a first kiss that was soft, searching, and full of questions, as if he were asking whether she was ready to trust again. Emily closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash through her, the kiss unhurried, patient, made of warmth instead of urgency, enough to tell her she was safe, that she was seen. Her initial fear began to dissolve, replaced by a fragile tenderness, and she lifted a hand to his shoulder, the warmth of him radiating into her. Daniel drew her closer with the same slow restraint, as though he understood she needed every second to believe in him fully, their breaths mingling, careful, yet threaded with quiet yearning. Emily felt the old terror Kyle's shadow, Kyle's control still lingering in her bones, but it was soothed by Daniel's steady hands, his unwavering eyes. The kiss broke for a moment, just long enough for them to breathe. And when Emily opened her eyes, she found Daniel watching her with a softness that held the weight of everything she had endured, everything that had shaped her into who she was now. For the first time in many months, she felt truly safe, not just freed from danger, but accepted. Daniel's faint smile, his hand still cupping her cheek, told her he wasn't going anywhere, that he would be here, a shoulder to lean on if she wanted it. A swirl of emotion rose in her uncertainty, fear, longing, and gentleness woven tightly together, and she told herself she could trust this man, that he hadn't only rescued her body, but had begun touching parts of her soul she thought were ruined. The kiss resumed, deeper this time, still controlled, still steady, and Emily responded, her arms slipping around his neck, warmth spreading through her chest like a tide, realizing this wasn't fleeting attraction, but solace, connection, and the feeling of being truly seen. When their lips finally parted, their foreheads resting together, both of them breathing harder than before, Emily felt a rare peace settle into her heart, a quiet knowing that she wasn't alone anymore, that someone stood between her and the darkness, protecting her while also giving her space to feel freely. They sat there pressed close, silent but not distant, the first kiss becoming something more than a gesture. It became an invisible vow, a promise of trust, gentleness, and a connection Emily had never experienced before. In that moment she knew that no matter how deep the shadows around them were, she had found someone who made her believe she could live, not just survive, and feel without running. That night, after Emily settled into the safe apartment, Daniel stepped out, his eyes turning cold and resolute, stripped of hesitation, and the sleek black car carried him through the empty streets toward an old warehouse buried deep in an industrial stretch beyond Manhattan, a place untouched by streetlights where only silent cars and watchful figures stood guard. He walked across the concrete floor, each step echoing beneath the metallic air thick with oil and rust, approaching a line of men in dark suits, their gazes sharp and assessing, muscles coiled in tension. Daniel recognized them immediately, Kyle's affiliates, tied to the same organization whose shadows had brushed against Emily's life. They said nothing, only watched him with a mixture of caution and challenge. Daniel offered a slight shrug, a gesture calm yet loaded with command, lifting his hand in a wordless greeting that deepened the already heavy atmosphere. Don Valenti stepped forward, his silver hair gleaming under the harsh lights, his eyes the same icy blue as Kyle's, fixed on Daniel. "You're causing a lot of trouble for my operations, Moretti," the old man said, his voice rough with smoke and age. "Over a girl?" "Not just a girl," Daniel replied calmly, stepping closer until he was face to face with the crime boss. "Your son, Kyle, is out of control. He's messy. He's impulsive. Attempted murder on a subway platform? That brings heat you don't want. The police are asking questions even you can't silence forever." Daniel lowered his voice, delivering the final blow. "If Kyle comes near her again, I won't just stop him. I will dismantle everything you've built. Is protecting a reckless son worth losing your empire?" The older man hesitated, looking at the photos of Kyle's erratic behavior Daniel had thrown on the table. He clenched his jaw, realizing his son had become a liability he could no longer afford. Finally, he looked at Daniel and gave a stiff nod. "I'll handle him. He won't bother her again." Daniel held his gaze for a moment longer, ensuring the message was absolute. He sent a few messages from his phone, ensuring Kyle's network understood they were being monitored, every action tracked. The room seemed to freeze, only Daniel's breath and the quiet shuffle of footsteps breaking the silence. At last, the silver-haired man signaled his men to withdraw, and Daniel stepped back, returning to his car. Daniel drove back through the city, street after street bearing witness to the weight of what had just happened, and he said nothing because he didn't need words. He only thought of Emily, of her safety, of her peace. When he stepped back into the apartment, Emily looked at him with worry and quiet astonishment, sensing he had crossed into something dark for her sake. Daniel offered only a small, gentle smile, no explanations, just a look that promised everything was under control, that no matter what shadows surrounded them, he had already stood between her and every threat. And for the first time in weeks, Emily let out a long breath, knowing someone had placed himself in the line of darkness for her, someone who would not allow harm to reach her again. When Daniel walked back into the apartment after his tense confrontation with Kyle's organization, Emily sensed something different in the way he moved, his eyes still cold and resolute, but carrying a trace of exhaustion she rarely saw. And she couldn't remain silent any longer as she stepped toward him, her voice trembling yet firm as she said she wanted to go with him, wanted to witness with her own eyes how he ended everything with Kyle, wanted to feel that she wasn't just someone being protected, but a part of the battle he was fighting. Daniel frowned, shaking his head, his gaze settling on her without softening, and Emily didn't understand right away why she couldn't go with him, why after surviving the terror, the days of being hunted, the fear carved into her bones, she wasn't allowed to stand beside him and see the outcome, why she couldn't share even a fraction of the power and certainty he carried. But Daniel stayed serious as he explained that this wasn't something she could walk into, not because he didn't trust her, but because the world he was entering was a place where a single misstep could cost a life. If she went with him, the danger would multiply. Her movements would be watched. Any gesture could be used as leverage, and he refused to let her become a target instead of someone he protected. His eyes held worry, but his firmness built a wall between them. An invisible barrier Emily felt immediately, startling her with the sting of exclusion, a feeling painfully familiar from her past with Kyle, when every decision was taken from her. Now, once again, she found herself shut out of something vital. Even if reason told her Daniel was trying to keep her safe, her heart still ached. She lowered her head, looking at her hands, disappointment carved clearly across her features, and Daniel stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice low and steady as he told her she would be safe here. That she didn't need to witness anything, that it would all be over soon. He didn't elaborate, but Emily felt the distance grow, her longing to stand beside him, to face the danger, to share the moment of reckoning with Kyle closing behind a locked door. She bowed her head, swallowing her disappointment and fear, though she listened, and Daniel watched her for a long time, his gaze softer, but his resolve unshaken. He couldn't change his decision. She had to stay hidden. Absolutely no one could know she was there. No mistakes could be allowed, and if anything happened to her, he would never forgive himself. Emily nodded quietly, the sting of exclusion still present. But she knew he was right. She had to survive, had to remain safe, and that mattered more than anything else. When Daniel left, closing the door behind him, she listened to the fading echo of his footsteps, the apartment falling into a silence so deep she could hear her own heartbeat. Loneliness rose to meet relief, and she realized she had been shut out of a battle while being protected from death at the same time. Her heartbeat slowly steadied, though the longing to stand with Daniel still burned inside her. She sat on the sofa looking out the window at the city lights reflecting across the glass, caught between safety and solitude, trust and disappointment, unable to sleep. She knew she was learning to trust Daniel's protection, but also learning the bitter truth that in this world, she wouldn't always have the right to participate, that survival sometimes meant waiting, watching, staying still. Her heart felt tender and strong at once, afraid and determined, and she understood she needed patience, that this exclusion wasn't a rejection of affection or trust, but a lesson in survival. She closed her eyes, the streetlight casting its soft glow across her face, breathing deeply as she accepted her place for now, standing outside the battle but still alive, still allowed to breathe, still allowed to believe Daniel would return, and everything would eventually be all right. The message from Daniel announcing that Kyle had finally been brought before the law made Emily's heart race as she sat quietly in the safe house, the streetlight drifting through the window casting pale stripes of light across the floor. Kyle's image flickering in her mind like a ghost refusing to die. She listened as Daniel explained that without his father's protection, Kyle was nothing. The Valenti family had cut him off to save themselves. The police, no longer bribed to look the other way, finally executed the arrest warrant. Through evidence, camera recordings, Kyle had been arrested and could no longer escape justice, forced to face the consequences of his violence, stalking, and crimes. Emily nodded, yet she felt no wave of relief. Instead, her heart remained tense, memories of being followed, manipulated, threatened pressing deeply into her body, the vivid recollection of his hand gripping her arm on the subway stairs, the terror as she fell onto the tracks, still alive inside her. She reminded herself that the law had done its part, but it could not erase the fear carved into her soul. Closing her eyes, she tried to breathe deeply, but the helplessness she had felt in the face of danger weighed heavily. Daniel stepped into the room, his gaze no longer the cold one he had worn with Kyle's organization, but softened with relief and concern as he sat beside her, his voice steady as he told her she no longer had to worry, that Kyle couldn't reach her, that every avenue he once had was now sealed. But Emily looked out the window at the flickering lights of the city, the uneasiness still threading through her. She knew safety was not the same as peace, that she had to learn how to trust again and heal on her own terms. Daniel seemed to read every thought as he watched her, understanding that her sense of relief wouldn't come simply from Kyle's arrest, but from regaining control over her own life, something Kyle had stolen from her. Emily turned toward him, fear still burning beneath her determination. She knew she needed time to trust completely, to stop shaking inside. Daniel placed his hand over hers, squeezing gently, a gesture both comforting and a reminder that she wasn't alone. She felt the strength in his presence, but inside she told herself that her independence had to grow alongside the protection he offered. She inhaled deeply, eyes fixed on the muted city outside. She wasn't relieved, not yet, but she was alive, and being protected gave her a small, fragile sense of steadiness. Daniel emphasized that every risk had been neutralized, that Kyle would face justice and never have power over her again, and Emily nodded, though her heart still wrestled with the loss of control she had endured, the nights of running, the haunting tension of being watched. She knew she had to overcome her fear from within, had to learn to trust both herself and Daniel. He led her to the balcony to look over the city, telling her she had survived a nightmare and was now allowed to breathe, allowed to begin again. Yet as Emily stared at the glowing night sky, she realized relief wouldn't come from Kyle's punishment, but from reclaiming her power, from no longer letting anyone's actions dictate her life. She returned inside, sitting close to Daniel, their hands intertwined, feeling a mix of safety and unease beating through her chest, though growing steadier with each breath. Emily understood she wasn't relieved, not yet, but she had taken the first essential step toward facing her fear. She could live, breathe, and slowly rebuild her life even with echoes of the past still lingering. Daniel looked at her with a knowing, reassuring gaze, his hand tightening slightly as if to send her strength, as if to remind her she had already survived the darkest part. Emily nodded, drawing a slow breath as her heartbeat found its rhythm again, knowing she wasn't fully at peace, but she was alive, healing, and gradually taking her life back. The quiet of the night wrapped around the apartment, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock, and Emily's steady breathing as she drifted in a restless sleep, locked inside a nightmare, Kyle's figure appearing in the darkness, moving slowly but with overwhelming force, his hand reaching for her, as if trying to pull her back into the moments that had terrified her most, her heart pounding as cold sweat gathered on her forehead, her body fighting to rise but trapped as if bound, her scream caught in her throat, the faint light from the window passing across shifting shadows like a maze of fear. The bedroom door creaked open and Daniel appeared, his silhouette filling the doorway, his eyes full of worry, yet his presence didn't frighten her but steadied her. He stepped toward the bed and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his breath warm in the cold room, and Emily blinked up at him as tears slipped down her cheeks, whispering his name like a plea. And Daniel said nothing as he sat beside her and wrapped his arms around her, his heartbeat steady and strong against her ear, reminding her that she was safe. The nightmare still clung to her, but his presence built an invisible wall around her fear, her body trembling as she leaned into him, caught between terror and relief, and Daniel whispered soft reassurances, reminding her it was only a dream, that she was safe, that nothing could harm her now. Emily drew in a long breath, trying to borrow strength from the rise and fall of his chest, sensing the steadiness in his gaze as fear slowly gave way to a fragile thread of trust, and she rested her head against him, listening to the pulse of life she once feared she had lost. Daniel stroked her hair, his voice low as he told her to sleep, promising he would keep watch. And she nodded faintly, her body slowly loosening, though the nightmare still hovered at the edges of her mind. The knowledge settling in her that fear did not vanish easily. Daniel whispered again, his voice warm and firm, reminding her she was not alone, and gradually Emily felt the safety of his closeness, her eyes drifting shut even as each breath carried the lingering tension of the past, knowing there would be many nights like this before she could truly rest. Daniel stayed beside her, his arms firm around her, his eyes following every small movement, never leaving her even for a moment, standing like a solid barrier against the darkness, and Emily felt both frightened and comforted, aware that protection did not erase the shadows of trauma. Each memory of Kyle, every moment of manipulation and threat, every tremor of helplessness still lived beneath her skin, and Daniel whispered that she had every right to be afraid, while gently reminding her she had survived and didn't have to endure alone. Emily inhaled deeply, taking in the warmth of his body and the calm in his heartbeat, understanding that within the darkness of her fear, she still had a place of refuge, a point of safety she could trust. Time moved slowly, each minute stretching out as Daniel remained steady beside her, and she felt her dread slowly fade, replaced by the quiet awareness of being protected and accompanied. She exhaled, the sweat drying on her skin, the tension not gone but no longer drowning her. Daniel watched her with determined eyes, as if urging strength into her weary heart, and Emily shifted slightly to lean more fully into him, knowing that tonight, even if the nightmares still lingered, she was not alone. She had Daniel beside her, guarding her, grounding her, the one anchor helping her face the darkness inside herself. Emily stayed leaning against Daniel, the dim room light brushing across his features, revealing the strain and worry etched in his eyes. And she sensed that the tension in the room came not only from her nightmare, but from him as well. Daniel breathed out slowly, his voice heavy and low as he murmured that he wanted to protect her. But he was afraid, the words hanging in the quiet like a confession she had never heard from him before. She turned to him, eyes widening in surprise and something like fear, and Daniel lowered his head, his hand holding hers trembling slightly as if he were wrestling with his own sense of helplessness. He said he had faced many things, confronted people he thought he could manage, but when it came to her he realized nothing had prepared him for the weight of this fear and responsibility. Emily felt the truth in his voice, her heart tightening with pain and warmth all at once, and she squeezed his hand as if offering him comfort. Daniel lifted his gaze to meet hers, admitting that he had always believed his strength was enough to shield her from anything. But she didn't know that this fear didn't come from the world outside but from within him, a fear that he might not be enough to keep her safe. Emily listened without interruption, feeling a rush of tenderness and understanding as she recognized the thin line between strength and vulnerability, between protection and helplessness, sensing that Daniel too was human, carrying his own fears, wishing to protect, but knowing he couldn't control everything. He confessed that he wanted to hold her tightly, but feared that at any moment the past might return and harm her again, his words faltering as their heartbeats fell into the same rhythm. The brief silence between them made Emily feel every tremor of his breath, every unspoken fear. He said he didn't want her to suffer, but he was still afraid, and as he spoke, Emily understood that this fear didn't make him weaker. It made him more real, more human. Sitting close like that, she saw a Daniel who was both strong and fragile, both her protector and someone who needed to be trusted. She drew a long breath, anchoring herself in the truth of his admission, feeling both frightened and reassured, two people standing in the dimness sharing their worries and finding understanding in the overlap. Daniel tightened his hand around hers, a gesture of commitment and also an acknowledgement of his limits. Emily rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the vibration of his breath, each of his words imprinting themselves on her heart. I want to protect you, but I am afraid was not a confession of weakness, but a reminder that love and responsibility often walked hand in hand with fear. She could only respond by holding his hand tighter, exhausted yet feeling whole in a quiet, tender way. Their eyes met in silence, and in that space between fear and tenderness, they found each other, and she knew that even though fear still lived within both of them, they would face it together. Daniel didn't leave. He stayed right there, beside her, both protecting her and sharing his fear, and Emily understood that love wasn't always perfect, but sincerity and presence were the strongest refuge she could ever have. In that quiet room, two people sat with the truth of themselves, with their fear and their love, and even with fear present, they found connection and trust that they would endure it together. Emily pulled her hand away from Daniel's, her eyes holding his with a steady intensity, her chest still pounding from his earlier confession. Yet now something different stirred within her, a quiet but undeniable strength threading itself through the remnants of fear. She drew in a deep breath and said, "Let me choose," her voice trembling and resolute at the same time. And Daniel froze, his eyes widening as the room's soft light revealed every line of tension in her expression, and he recognized that this was a turning point. A moment when Emily was no longer simply someone protected, but someone claiming the right to decide her own fate. He stepped closer, his voice low and gentle as he reminded her she didn't have to carry everything alone. His hand still lifted as if wanting to bring her back to him, but she shook her head. "Not this time. I want to choose," she said, her heart aching and brimming with resolve. Daniel stared at her, his pulse seeming to pause for several long seconds before he exhaled, his eyes shaded with sadness and pride, realizing that strength was not always forcing someone to follow you, but sometimes giving them the freedom to decide for themselves. Emily stepped toward the window, the glow of the street lamps casting shifting shadows across her face, echoing the conflict within her. And when she turned back, her gaze was unwavering as she told him she wanted to stand with him, but needed to choose her own way of walking beside him. He nodded slowly, every muscle in his face tightening as he fought to steady his emotions, saying he understood and that from this moment on he would not force her. He would stand beside her, but she would make the decisions. She heard the shift in his tone, a gentleness that still carried strength, and she breathed deeply as memories of her months of running resurfaced. The fear that had once followed her everywhere Kyle appeared. But now a different feeling rose within her, not manipulation or control, but the quiet power of her own choice. Daniel approached her but left enough distance for her to breathe freely. His voice soft yet firm as he said she could choose anything she wanted and he would honor it. Emily didn't answer at first, her eyes filling with tears that came not from fear, but from the deep emotion of finally receiving a freedom she had longed for, and Daniel bowed his head slightly, telling her he was ready to listen. Her heartbeat steadied, her sense of safety shifting from mere protection to the dignity of being allowed to choose. And when she finally opened her eyes, her voice clear and certain, she said she wanted to go with him, but in her own way. Daniel smiled, a rare, gentle smile that brightened the room, and he extended his hand without pressure, waiting only for her willingness. Emily took it, her pulse racing with a mix of nervousness and completeness, feeling for the first time that she was no longer the fragile one being shielded but someone choosing her own path. Daniel tightened his hold, calm filling his eyes, and the two of them stood between shadow and light, in the place where fear and love coexisted. And Emily understood that her choice reshaped not only her life, but the way Daniel saw their bond. She smiled as tears slid down her cheeks, No longer tears of terror, but tears of strength and freedom. And in that quiet moment, she knew that with her choice made, Daniel would honor it. All the old tension, all the past dread seemed to dissolve, leaving only the raw connection between them and the right to decide that she had reclaimed. They stood together, strong and vulnerable, loving and cautious, and for the first time in months, Emily felt truly free. She opened her eyes to a gentle morning in her new apartment, sunlight filtering through thin curtains onto the warm wooden floor, the clean, open room filling her with an unfamiliar peace. She breathed in the fresh New York air drifting through the cracked window, the rush of traffic and city life reminding her she had returned to the world, no longer bound by her past or by Kyle's suffocating control. Daniel entered with a steaming cup of coffee, smiling at her with a tenderness layered with caution, and she smiled back as her heartbeat slowed, safety settling into her like something warm and solid. They sat by the window sharing small moments and simple stories, each one more precious than anything she had known before, and Emily felt the quiet joy of being heard, understood, and respected. At noon, they stepped outside, Emily walking the streets of New York for the first time without fear of Kyle's shadow or his threats, wearing her favorite coat and comfortable shoes, taking in the towering buildings, bright storefronts, and passing faces as if the city had become a new world waiting for her. Daniel walked beside her, always close enough to keep her safe, yet far enough for her to feel her own freedom, and Emily felt no control, only an indescribable excitement. Inside a small cafe, Daniel lightly touched her arm and asked what she wanted to drink, and Emily nodded with a sense of being cared for without being controlled, a feeling that made her stronger. She wondered whether she deserved this gentleness, but seeing Daniel's quiet smile, she knew he wanted nothing more than her happiness and safety. They sat by the window watching the city move past as Emily shared her small hopes and the dreams she never dared to imagine under Kyle's control, and Daniel listened without interrupting, offering suggestions only when needed, every word affirming that she now truly had the right to choose. That evening, back in her new apartment with warm lights cast across the furnishings she had chosen herself, she ran her fingers along the objects that represented her reclaimed independence. She opened the window, breathing in the night air, freedom filling her chest, and Daniel placed his hands gently on her shoulders, their silence warm and full. Emily knew she was no longer alone, yet she stood firmly on her own feet. At the end of the day, they sat together on the sofa, sipping coffee, sharing quiet smiles, and Emily felt a genuine, simple joy, knowing she had stepped out of the darkness and into the life she chose, a life she could shape for herself. Daniel's eyes shone with trust, and Emily smiled because she understood that this new beginning wasn't about a new apartment or a new city, but about freedom, about choice, and the capacity to love without fear or control. In the heart of New York's restless energy, Emily realized she had begun a new chapter, one fully in her hands, with Daniel beside her but never pressing her, and above all, with her freedom intact. My dear mother, I am sitting here in my new apartment in New York, looking out at the busy streets with a strange sense of peace and ease. Everything is unfamiliar, yet filled with hope. I want to tell you that life is never just black or white. It can be dark and frightening, but it can also open doors to freedom and happiness if we dare to step beyond our fear. Through the past months, I have learned that strength does not come from controlling others, but from being able to stand up for myself, choose my own path, and trust the people who truly care. Daniel came into my life not to control me, but to protect and listen, to give me the chance to live freely. From him, I learned that the essence of love is respect and freedom. For those who are toxic like Kyle once was, nothing is more terrifying than living in fear without speaking up or seeking a way out. Now, I have learned to look fear in the eye and not let it dictate my life. Mother, I know things are not perfect yet, but I am moving in the right direction, living and loving in my own way. I hope you know that I am finally safe. Always believe in yourself, cherish the quiet moments, and remember that each of us deserves happiness and freedom. With love, Emily. If this story touched your heart, or if you saw a part of yourself in Emily's strength, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories to you every single day. And tell me, have you ever had to find the courage to start over? Feel free to leave a comment below. We treasure every word you share with us. I wish everyone watching this video good health, joyful days, and peace in every moment. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.